Second episode begins on the Battle of Passchendaele in Belgium during World War I, 1917. Lieutenant Henry Beauchamp defies his captain's orders by rescuing an injured private on the battlefield. He comforts the young man in his last moments. This spurs Henry to write an open letter to anyone who will read it. He poses the age-old question, what's the point? This war is long and hope is dwindling. Why does any of this matter? What is there to live for? As Henry writes his letter, we see a montage of him fighting alongside his troop. Henry's quite an eloquent writer. After this, we cut to the War Office, Post and Telegraph Censorship Department in London, 1917. Julia stumbles upon Henry's letter. It moves her, and she replies to him. What transpires next is a back and forth between these newly christened pen pals. It's abundantly clear they're falling for each other. Julia gives Henry hope, which he sorely needs to get through the war. Julia tells him about her love for Scotland. Henry admits he's never been, but hopes to visit the Highlands with her someday. In one letter, Henry states his plan of asking for leave the following month. He won't have time for a trip to Scotland. However, he can finally meet Julia in person in London. As Julia reads this, planes invade the airspace above the city, dropping bombs throughout. One explosion sends debris flying through Julia's window. She ducks under her table for shelter. 2 weeks pass, and Julia hasn't heard from Henry. She's nervous. What if he died on the battlefield? When she leaves work, though, Henry is waiting for her on the steps. They embrace. Then, they have sex in Julia's apartment. Conversation turns to the subject of marriage, which Julia isn't opposed to. Sure enough, the next scene sees our lovebirds as the Beauchamps, having tied the knot. After this, Julia comforts Henry as he copes with his PTSD from his time in the war. Julia is Henry's beacon, his glimmer of hope, now and always. Later, we return to the end of the premiere episode. Julia has traveled through the stones. She wakes up in the 18th century. Julia notices the gem in her wedding ring is missing. Craig Dunn always requires jewels for travel. Julia calls out for Henry, assuming she's still in her present time. Then, she writes on a rock with an arrow, hoping he will see the message and find her. Next, Julia flags down a couple who ride down the road in a wagon. They only speak Gaelic. They refer to her as Sassenach, like mother, like daughter. Julia asks if they've seen Henry, describing his physical appearance. She mentions Inverness, which they call Invernice in Scottish Gaelic. The couple motions for her to join them in the wagon, seemingly implying that they can take her to Inverness. Suddenly, a third person with them puts a sack over Julia's head and knocks her unconscious. They place her in the wagon and take her to, presumably, Castle Leathers. Meanwhile, Henry goes through the stones. He calls out for Julia. Then, he discovers her message on the rock and follows the arrow. Later, Julia wakes up in a dimly lit room with Davina. As it turns out, the couple who brought Julia to Castle Leathers, the Connors, used her to pay off their debts to Lord Lovat. Julia meets Lord Lovat while Brian watches from afar. Lovat is super gross with Julia. He orders Davina to dress Julia in something more appropriate for being a maidservant. Julia begs to know where Henry is and urges Lovat to release her. She doesn't belong here. After this interaction, Brian proposes that Lovat accept money from the Connors too. Clan Fraser desperately needs the money. The castle could use repairs. Lovat brushes off his son's suggestion. Meanwhile, Henry asks a couple of Scotsmen, who also clock him as a Sassenach, if they have seen Julia. He wanders into a nearby pub and asks the bartender the same question. Everyone therein practically laughs him out of the establishment. Temporarily resigned, Henry asks for a pint of ale. Malcolm pays for it. Henry thanks him. He notices Malcolm and Clan Grant's Bladier discussing property deed matters. As he walks by, Henry whispers his opinion to Malcolm. Archbug and the Bladier almost drop Henry down a well before Malcolm asks him to elaborate. Henry whispers something else in Malcolm's ear. It's enough to persuade Malcolm to bring Henry to Beaumont House, Clan Grant's seat, to meet his father. Elsewhere, Davina trains Julia in the art of being a maid. Julia insists she's not supposed to be here. She must find her husband. She's not property. Julia lost Henry, but he's not dead. Time travel and all that. Julia pivots, asking Davina about the day and the year. She realizes she's in 1714 Scotland. Davina advises Julia not to linger in Lovat's presence, which is essentially what we heard in episode 1. At the same time, Henry and Malcolm arrive at Beaumont House. He meets Isaac, Laird of Clan Grant. Malcolm urges Henry to tell his father what he knows about the property deed discussion at the pub with the Campbells. Henry applies his experience as a solicitor to the situation. He also informs Isaac that his blade-ear was misrepresenting him. In fact, check his pockets. You will find a bag of coins therein. So, Isaac sends Arch to beat the snot out of said blade-ear. Arch returns with a bag of coins. Isaac wants to hire Henry as his new blade-ear. Initially, Henry declines the offer, citing that he has more pressing matters. He's looking for someone. Isaac insists that Henry will have access to everything Clan Grant has to offer. They'll also travel across clan lands, covering a lot of ground. Henry accepts the job offer. Later, Julia performs her maid duties at Castle Leathers. While in Lovat's office, she finds a map of the countryside leading to Inverness. She conceals it after grabbing blank parchment and hiding it in her dress. Lovat observes her from the hallway. He asks her what she's doing in there. Julia asserts she was merely dusting. Now she must help Davina with the mending. That evening, Julia attempts to escape. We see her running away from the castle. However, Brian catches up to her on horseback. He urges her to turn back, citing that a storm is coming, and you don't want to be caught in a storm in the Highlands. Suddenly, Lovat's muscle, Balak, catches Julia and brings her back to the castle. Julia insists she doesn't belong here. Lovat reveals that the punishment for trying to run away is 20 lashings. Brian takes the fall for Julia, claiming he persuaded her to leave. It was his idea. So, Lovat orders Balak to administer the 20 lashings on Brian instead. His own son. Davina escorts Julia back to her quarters. Elsewhere, Arch leads Henry to the Bladier's quarters at Beaumont House. He sees what happened to the last Bladier. The man's head is on a spike. 1 month later, Henry meets with Ned in the Grant carriage. This is following Dougal's attack on the Grants. Henry informs Ned that Isaac is pissed. He wants Dougal's head. However, Ned has a proposal to assuage the tension between the clans. What if they offer Ellen as a bride for Malcolm? A betrothal might work wonders. Henry hesitates. Ned mentions that he heard that Henry was asking for a woman at the gathering. Henry claims he has very particular tastes regarding women. Ned offers to help Henry satisfy his carnal cravings if the latter brings the marriage proposal to Isaac. Henry agrees to this. That evening, Julia writes Henry a letter in her quarters. Henry also pens a letter for his wife. He vows never to stop looking for her. Both admit how much they miss the other and baby Claire. Julia hopes Henry is with Claire in the present. A montage plays out as Julia and Henry go about their new duties in this strange world, two people out of time. They each seal their respective letters with a kiss. They will find each other no matter what.